Welcome to the first video on logic formulas. In this video, we're going to talk about just the simple if statement, just to get you started, and then we're going to add into it the and, or, and not formulas, and make it a little bit more complex. Let's get started. Here's a new spreadsheet named Budget versus Actual Data, and it's summarized by department. So for the executive department, we set up a budget at the beginning of the year for $175,000, and we actually spent $186,000, so we overspent by $11,000. Now we want to see if this variance falls within the tolerance that we set up at the beginning of the year, which was 10% of the budget, which in turn is $17,500. And so we're going to go ahead and use this table to start working with these if statements. So writing our first if statement, let's first understand what it is. So if we start typing if, Excel tells us that it checks whether a condition is met and returns one value if it's true and another if it's false. So it's just like if you're talking in normal everyday language and you say, hey, are you going to go to the grocery store? If you are, go ahead and pick up some bread. If you're not, go home, hop online, watch the cruder.com video, something like that. So you could go ahead and say if the logic test, in this case, did you go to the grocery store? Or, hey, is this variance negative or something like that? So let's say, hey, if this value is less than 0, which means they've overspent, which in the executive department's case, they did. They overspent by $11,000. Then I want it to go ahead and signify when this value is true, which it is less than 0. So I want to have it signify that this is a bad thing. So I want to say bad. Otherwise, I'm going to say good and then end it. So the beginning, if you look at this again, logic test is right here, separated with a comma to get us into the value of true, and then separate it again with a comma to get into the value of false. And false if it's greater than 0, which is good. So I hit enter and it says it's bad. Now I drag it down, and again you can see that the rest are bad except for these two. So HR and IT both had positive variances, meaning that they underspent on their budget. So the if statement is a real useful tool if you have a bunch of different conditions, a large spreadsheet that you need to run the same condition on, or the same if statement. And just thinking of it, if you had 1,000 people you're going to ask, are you going to the grocery store? It'd be much easier to go ahead in a list and just drag it down versus ask every single person, or which would mean like you're physically going through and labeling by hand BAD or GOOD, and you're doing copy and pasting and stuff like that just to make everything work. So if you can write a formula to allow Excel to do the work for you, you're much better off, especially in the long run. If you think about it, maybe you need to update these numbers for 2016. So the budget changed to $200,000 for the executive department, and they actually only spent $195,000 or $196,000 the following year. So now it actually changes from, let me grab this formula, pull it back up, it changes from bad to good. So the thing is that you don't want to have to always manually think about things that are so simple it just wastes your own time. That's what a formula is set up for. It's to save you time. Now before we move on, let's go ahead and change this back so that it's a bad variance. So I'm going to say 210, 1, 2, 3, $10,000 to the bad. Now let's go ahead, and the next thing we need to learn is multiple criteria within an if statement. So two things that need to be true for it to continue on to the next item. Which means, like, let's go back to the same example of the grocery store. So if you're going to the grocery store, that's condition number 1. You're either going or not going. Then you could say, hey, if there's white bread, go ahead and buy the white. If there's not white bread, go ahead and get the wheat. So let's put in two different statements, basically using this and formula, and say two logic tests. Logic 1, and then a comma, and then logic number 2. So that's the same thing of saying, hey, is this less than 0, and is the absolute value of $10,000, which is negative 10,000, so absolute value of that is 10,000 positive, is that greater than the tolerance? Because if it's greater than the tolerance, then we have a really big issue because you overspent, and you overspent by even the tolerance amount that you were allowed. So if I end the parentheses, it should come back false because they did overspend, but they didn't go past the total tolerance. So let's carry this down and see if any of the other departments did. And you can see these bottom 3 all spent over the amount of the tolerance. They overspent here, you can see that's negative, and they overspent even past this tolerance amount. So now we could actually go ahead, let me delete the bottom half. You can go ahead and put this false answer within a formula, within an if statement formula. So I'm going to say if the logic test. So if you already have something that says false, that's basically telling the formula like it's already false. So I'm just going to reference the false, and I'll put in the value if it's true, but again, if you have something stated false, it's not going to go to the true. It'll automatically just default and go to the false. So, but if it is true, this is say very bad. Otherwise, just say okay. And so we're okay here. And again, I've done this in the past. I go ahead and put in 2 different steps where I type the formula there and I type it here as well. And I'm referencing with this K8 a formula. So instead of just having it as a reference, I'm going to go in here, copy this portion. So I'm going to leave out the equal sign, go into K8 and replace it with that formula. And I'm going to delete this and go back up here. I'm going to copy this whole formula so that I can insert it 1 line above where it should be at. Okay. So now I'm going to drag it down, and you can see these all say okay because these were the false answers, and these all say very bad because they were the true answers. So that is how you can go ahead and use multiple criteria. There's not just one condition, but there's actually 2 conditions that need to be met to make it true. The next thing we can learn about is the OR formula. And it's very similar to the AND formula in the sense that it will return a true or false value. So let's back up and read this. So Excel is telling us that it checks whether any of the arguments are true and returns true or false. It will return false only if all arguments are false. So if you open up the formula, it's giving you different logic tests that you can put in here. And so let's just make a real easy example and say the number 1 is equal to the number 1, and the number 1 is equal to the number 0. So the first statement is obviously true, the second statement is obviously false, but overall it will return a true statement because I'm saying this or that being true, and yes, one of them is true, therefore it returns a true answer. So it's pretty simple to understand, but let's go ahead and just put in the same criteria that we had in the last example and say, hey, if this is less than 0, or let's say this budget is greater than $190,000, then go ahead and say something. So that returns true. So I'm going to say if this is true, say bad. Otherwise, say good. You can do whatever you want in here. I mean, you could do a formula, any sort of operation that you want to do if something is true or false. So let's end it here. Again, I did it in 2 steps. Just get in the habit of doing it in 2 steps, especially when you're learning. It's more difficult to go ahead and just write it all at once. So what I do is copy it there and go back to the formula or the reference cell and replace it with the formula behind the reference cell. So I'm going to hit enter. This formula is no longer needed because it's not referenced. But since this is now on the second row, I want to replace it and bring it up to 1. So I'm going to copy it, paste it up here, delete that, and then I'm going to carry this down and see if anything changes. So looks like we have a winner. We got a winner on this guy. He says that it's good, meaning this is less than 0 or this is greater than 190,000. So both of these are false and therefore it returned good. The last thing that we're going to quickly go over is the NOT formula. And the NOT formula goes ahead and Excel tells us that it changes false to true and true to false. So if we have a false answer within the NOT formula, it's going to flip it to true. So again, let's go back and use one of these and or. Let's use equals and. 1 equals 1 and let's say 2 equals 2. That's obviously true. But if we go ahead and say not and put it within it or reference that, it's just going to return false. So again, you copy this in, replace the reference cell, and you see that, hey, this is now false. But if you come in here and change this to 3, so 1 equals 1 and 2 equals 3, obviously that's false, but it will return true. So it's just a quick way to go ahead and flip the signs if you need to do that.